In the winter of 1842, the Calloway family carved out a tenuous existence deep within the Appalachian hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mist clung to the trees like a shroud and the wind whispered through the skeletal branches of oaks and hickories. The small log cabin they called home stood on the edge of a narrow creek, its roof sagging and smoke curling from a stone chimney that seemed perpetually half-collapsed. Here, removed from the nearest town by nearly 20 miles of rugged terrain, the Calloways lived as if time itself had forgotten them. They were farmers, hunters, and craftsmen, yet there was an air of unease about them, as though the land itself recoiled from their presence. Their isolation was not merely geographic but moral, for the events that unfolded within the cabin would remain hidden behind these thick walls, known only to those who dared to enter the shadowed rooms. Neighbors spoke of strange sightings, figures moving behind curtained windows, voices raised in arguments that never reached the ears of outsiders, and the eerie laughter of children who seemed older than their years. John and Samuel Calloway, the eldest brothers, had grown up within these hollows, their childhood marked by harsh winters and a strict, unforgiving father who demanded obedience to both God and the harsh codes of the frontier. Their mother had died when they were young, leaving a cold silence in her absence that lingered in the corners of the cabin, filling the rooms with a sense of foreboding. The brothers inherited the land together, two souls bound by blood and necessity, yet each carried within him a restless, unspoken longing. By 1842, both were in their late 20s, strong, rugged men, whose hands bore the calluses of labor and whose eyes held the shadows of something unspeakable. The hollows provided them with sustenance, but the isolation also incubated desires and secrets that would have been unthinkable in a village, where eyes pried and tongues wagged. Here, among the dense woods and the constant drip of winter rain, the boundaries between right and forbidden began to blur, shaping the course of their lives in ways that would terrify those who would hear the tale. Elizabeth Calloway arrived in the fall of that year, a cousin from a distant county sent to live with the family after the death of her parents. She was 19, with a quiet strength that masked the vulnerability she carried from losing her family at such a young age. The brothers took her in, ostensibly as an act of familial duty, yet their attentions toward her were immediate and unsettling. Elizabeth moved among the cabin's rooms with a grace that contrasted sharply with the rough timber walls and the utilitarian clutter of frontier life. She tended the small garden, fed the animals, and helped with the endless tasks that the harsh land demanded. Yet even as she worked, she became the focal point of the brothers' obsessive regard, her presence a constant, unspoken tension that hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Outsiders who ventured near the property reported seeing the three of them walking together in the forest, the brothers flanking Elizabeth in a manner that was protective yet possessive, as if the very earth had ordained her as a prize to be guarded and shared in silence. The local community, though distant, sensed the peculiarity of the Calloways' household. Traders who stopped by to exchange goods for cornmeal or cured meat spoke quietly of strange behavior. Elizabeth appearing at the door at odd hours, the brothers disappearing into the woods for hours without explanation, and the low, murmuring voices that seemed to echo from the cabin at night. Superstitions ran deep in the hollows, and whispers spread that the family was touched by some ancient curse or unnatural bond. Tales of other isolated families in Kentucky occasionally spoke of madness, of rituals performed in secret, and of sins committed in the name of love or desperation. Yet none of the travelers could have imagined the depth of the truth, for what occurred within the Calloway cabin was beyond the scope of common morality, a shadow that would linger in local memory for decades. The landscape itself seemed to conspire with the family's isolation. Winter storms brought snowdrifts that buried the creek and forced the family indoors, where the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls and magnified the intensity of their interactions. Summer brought oppressive heat and the relentless buzz of insects, driving the family into the cabin's shadowed corners, where the closeness bred both intimacy and tension. Each day passed with an eerie rhythm, the lines between routine and ritual growing indistinct. The neighbors, distant though they were, occasionally glimpsed the oddities. Two men carrying firewood in silence, a young woman standing at the doorway with eyes that darted nervously, a sudden flare of shouting that would die down as quickly as it had arisen. In such a place, rumor and fact intertwined, creating a narrative that was at once horrifying and inevitable, as if the land itself had scripted the family's fate. The story of the Callaways in 1842 is not merely one of moral transgression, but of a human existence pushed to the extremes by isolation, hardship, and unspoken desire. The hollow carved them into figures both sympathetic and terrifying, bound together by blood, circumstance, and the unyielding weight of secrecy. The walls of the cabin absorbed their whispers, the forest echoed their footsteps, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that what unfolded there was not meant for the eyes or ears of the outside world. It was a world apart, a crucible of obsession and forbidden bonds, where every glance, every gesture, and every sigh carried a meaning heavier than the timber and stone that surrounded them. The bond between John and Samuel Callaway was forged in the crucible of hardship and the relentless isolation of eastern Kentucky, yet it was not merely brotherly affection that tethered them to one another. They moved through the hollows with an almost preternatural synchronization, hunting together, tending the fields, and splitting the work of survival with a rhythm that only blood could create. Their shared history was marked by trials that would have fractured most men, winters that froze crops to the ground, sudden illnesses that took livestock, and the deaths of parents who had left them without guidance. In those early years, a code developed, unspoken but absolute, that demanded loyalty and obedience not only to one another, but to the fragile ecosystem of their home. Yet beneath the surface of that loyalty simmered a darker current, one that would twist the simplicity of brotherhood into something far more complex, far more human, and far more forbidden. They were bound not just by necessity, but by a compulsion neither could fully articulate, a compulsion that would define their actions and reshape the life of Elizabeth Callaway. John, the elder by 3 years, was the more commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to pierce the shadows of the forest with uncanny focus. He carried himself with a rigidity that spoke of responsibility and a will shaped by the unforgiving terrain. Yet those same eyes betrayed a hunger, a desire that he could not, and perhaps would not, contain. Samuel, smaller but wiry and quick, followed the lead of his brother outwardly, yet inwardly he nurtured feelings that went beyond the bounds of familial loyalty. When Elizabeth arrived at the cabin, it was impossible for the brothers to resist the gravitational pull she exerted upon them both, and this mutual obsession quickly became a quiet tension that permeated every room of the cabin. Theirs was a relationship that defied description in polite terms. It was rooted in love, in desire, in the quiet terror of solitude, and in a perverse sense of necessity, as though sharing her was an act of survival rather than sin. The brothers' bond with each other began to transform in ways subtle and profound. Meals were eaten in silence, yet glances and gestures spoke volumes. Tasks were completed with an almost ritualistic precision, the forested landscape dictating when and how they moved, hunted, and worked. At night, the flickering firelight revealed a closeness that neighbors would have found disturbing, though no one dared approach too closely. The shared duties of daily life became intertwined with the shared obsession for Elizabeth, each brother vying for her attention while simultaneously acquiescing to the other's claim. The tension was palpable, a constant undercurrent that neither left the cabin nor allowed any other thought to take root. In the hollows, where neighbors were miles away and the law was a distant echo, the brothers constructed a world in which their bond and their desire existed without judgment. Yet it was a world teetering on the edge of disaster. Every encounter with Elizabeth added layers of complexity to the brothers' relationship. She moved among them like a living fulcrum, shifting the balance of power and affection with each glance and gesture. John's protection was fierce, bordering on territorial, while Samuel's attentions were quiet, patient, and insistent. Their competition was never openly declared, yet it was present in every shared meal, every journey to the creek, and every evening spent beside the hearth. The psychological weight of their arrangement pressed upon them both, creating a tension that could not be released except through acts that outsiders would consider shocking or incomprehensible. It was an intimacy that no one else could witness, one that relied on secrecy, subtlety, and the unspoken consent that only shared obsession can forge. The forest itself became a silent accomplice to their bond. Trails that twisted through dense undergrowth were marked by their footsteps. Small clearings became their private meeting places, and the creek that ran behind the cabin became a mirror of their clandestine world. Each day brought with it a careful negotiation, a balance of desire and restraint, a choreography of movement that ensured the delicate harmony between the brothers was preserved. They lived as if in a world apart, where every glance at Elizabeth, every brush of her hand, and every whispered word was a calculated risk. The land allowed them to sustain this equilibrium, but it also magnified the stakes, for in isolation, even the smallest disruption could cascade into disaster. By the end of that first year with Elizabeth, the brothers' bond had evolved into something both terrifying and hypnotic. It was no longer merely a relationship of survival. It was an entanglement of desire, obsession, and shared responsibility that shaped every aspect of their existence. The forest, the cabin, and the small hollows of Kentucky became not just a home, but a crucible in which the brothers were bound to one another in ways that society could never condone. Their shared obsession with Elizabeth forged a connection that was unbreakable, a silent covenant that dictated every breath, every motion, and every thought within the confines of their shadowed world. Elizabeth Calloway was a woman whose very presence seemed to alter the rhythm of the Calloway household, bending the currents of desire and tension that flowed through the cabin. When she arrived in the late autumn of 1842, her hair the color of chestnut and her eyes a muted green, she brought with her an innocence forged in tragedy, having lost both parents to illness and circumstance. The hollows of Kentucky were no place for such fragility, and yet she adapted with a quiet resilience, tending the animals, mending clothes, and performing the endless chores of frontier life with a diligence that commanded attention. It was not long before both John and Samuel found themselves captivated, drawn to her in ways that surpassed mere attraction, their obsessions entangled with the isolation and secrecy that defined their world. Elizabeth, for her part, seemed to sense the intensity of their regard, though whether she understood the depth of its implications is unclear. Her days were filled with labor, her nights with contemplation, and in that solitude, she began to recognize the extraordinary and unsettling role she had come to play in the Calloway household. The brothers' attentions were constant yet carefully measured, a dangerous dance of proximity and restraint that Elizabeth could neither fully accept nor fully reject. John would watch her from the edge of the kitchen, his gaze heavy with a mix of protectiveness and desire, while Samuel lingered silently near the fire, offering small gestures of help that spoke volumes in their subtlety. Each moment became charged with meaning, the air between them thick with tension, a quiet storm that had no outlet other than the glances, the touches, and the shared tasks that brought them together. In the eyes of outsiders, this household might have appeared ordinary, a family surviving against the hardships of frontier life, but within the walls of the cabin, the psychological landscape was far more treacherous. Elizabeth was at once a participant and a witness to a relationship that defied societal norms. Caught in the web of two men whose bond to each other was inseparable, yet whose desires could not be reconciled without her presence. Her own emotions became a labyrinth she could navigate only with caution. She found herself both drawn to and wary of John's commanding intensity, his hands rough from labor yet capable of gentleness, while Samuel's quiet persistence stirred a tenderness that contrasted sharply with his brother's forcefulness. The two men existed in her life as dual forces, each vying for her attention, each pulling her into a gravity that she could neither resist nor escape. The hollows provided cover, yet they also magnified the stakes, for in such isolation, the boundaries between choice and coercion blurred, and Elizabeth's life became an unspoken negotiation with forces that were larger than herself. She learned to move through the cabin with awareness, noting the angles of their gazes, the cadence of their footsteps, the subtle shifts in their moods, and how all these things converged to shape her existence. Every meal, every walk to the creek, every task in the garden was infused with the silent pressure of their desires and the unyielding scrutiny of the two men whose lives were entwined with hers in ways that could never be articulated. The seasons marked time in the hollow, yet they did little to ease the intensity of the relationship. Winter brought long nights by the fire, the cold driving the three of them together in ways that were at once necessary and intimate. Spring arrived with the thaw, offering chores in the fields and brief moments in the open air where tension could be disguised as practicality. Summer heat pressed them into the shade of the forest, where conversations and movements became subtle dances, and autumn returned with the dying leaves, casting the cabin in an amber gloom that mirrored the complexity of their lives. Elizabeth's presence was constant, a pivot upon which the brothers' bond turned, and yet she remained an enigma herself, sometimes yielding to their attentions, sometimes retreating into silence, her internal struggles hidden behind measured compliance and a veneer of composure. It was in these rhythms that the true horror of the situation emerged, not in violence, but in the psychological captivity that the trio had constructed for themselves, a world removed from morality and society, sustained by secrecy, compulsion, and the raw force of human desire. Neighbors in distant hollows began to murmur about Elizabeth, noting her pale skin, the dark circles under her eyes, and the furtive glances she exchanged with the brothers. Rumors drifted like smoke on the wind, hinting at unnatural attachments, at family secrets hidden deep within the forested valleys. Merchants who stopped briefly at the cabin reported oddities, Elizabeth carrying water with a stiffness in her posture, John and Samuel standing together at the edge of the clearing as if guarding her, the subtle intensity of an unseen drama that had no name. In such a remote area, gossip traveled slowly, yet the air itself seemed to carry whispers, and those sensitive to the Hollow's mood sensed something disquieting in the way the Callaways moved, spoke, and existed. Elizabeth's role, central to the family's dynamic, became a silent, ever-present force, one that neither John nor Samuel could relinquish without fracturing the bond that held them together and without shattering the delicate equilibrium they had built around her. Elizabeth Callaway's life in the cabin became a study in survival not only of the body but of the mind and spirit. She navigated the dual attentions of John and Samuel with care, forging an existence that balanced obedience, self-preservation, and the strange, forbidden intimacies forced upon her by circumstance. Every day required vigilance, every interaction a careful calculation, as the forest, the cabin, and the relentless hollows bore witness to a life lived at the edge of societal comprehension. In this isolated, unforgiving world, Elizabeth was neither a passive victim nor a willing participant in the traditional sense. She was a central figure in a psychological bond that defied law, religion, and morality, a living axis around which the Callaway household spun in shadow and secrecy. The neighbors of the Callaway family lived at a cautious distance, separated by the dense forests and winding creeks that carved the hollows of eastern Kentucky. Yet even from afar, the peculiarities of the household did not escape notice. Farmers traveling the old trails reported seeing flickering candlelight behind curtained windows long after darkness fell, shadows moving in patterns too deliberate to be random. Children who wandered too close would return with stories of whispered arguments, strange laughter, and a woman who watched them with eyes that were both sad and unnervingly knowing. These tales spread quietly at first, growing in intensity with each retelling, as if the land itself demanded that outsiders be warned without ever providing clear detail. Some whispered that the brothers were under a curse, that Elizabeth had been marked by some dark fate, and that the cabin itself was an instrument of a secret, forbidden covenant. In these stories, the mundane chores of frontier life became imbued with tension and dread, as every movement within the Callaway home seemed weighted with unspoken significance and hidden ritual. Merchants and travelers passing the hollow would sometimes glimpse the three of them together, John and Samuel flanking Elizabeth as they moved through the forest, their bodies rigid and alert as if guarding her from unseen threats. These scenes were not violent, nor were they openly menacing, yet there was an unmistakable intensity that unsettled observers. The brothers' vigilance appeared obsessive, their eyes scanning the edges of the trees, their hands lingering too long on tools or weapons, as though prepared to act at a moment's notice. Elizabeth's posture reflected a combination of submission and careful negotiation, her head tilted slightly downward, her eyes flicking toward each man in turn, aware of the delicate balance she maintained between them. Outsiders could not have understood the full depth of this arrangement, the psychological gravity that held the three together, nor the ways in which their isolation magnified each glance, each touch, each subtle act of possession. The hollows functioned as both refuge and prison, sheltering them from the judgment of society, while simultaneously trapping them within the ever-tightening orbit of their own obsessions. Whispers grew louder over time, particularly when neighbors noticed changes in Elizabeth's demeanor. She became pale, her hands rough from constant labor, and her eyes carried a weight that spoke of sleepless nights and unspoken tensions. The brothers, too, exhibited signs of strain, their faces etched with lines of worry, their movements sometimes jerky and abrupt as if they were always on the brink of confrontation. People passing by began to speculate, piecing together fragments of rumor into narratives that were often more terrifying than the reality itself. Some claimed to hear screams in the night, while others reported glimpses of shadowed figures moving unnaturally between the trees. These accounts were never verified, yet they sufficed to create a veil of fear around the Calloway property, a psychological barrier that kept most at a distance and allowed the household to continue its quiet, forbidden rituals without interference. The local preacher, a man whose visits were rare and hesitant, once attempted to speak to the family, offering guidance and the promise of spiritual oversight, yet he was met with a strange mixture of politeness and reticence. John and Samuel welcomed him cordially, yet the intensity of their gazes made him uneasy, and Elizabeth's quiet presence seemed to heighten the tension rather than alleviate it. Conversations remained surface level, avoiding any mention of the deeper currents that ran through the household, and the preacher left with a lingering sense of unease as though he had glimpsed a reality that was meant to remain hidden. The neighbors, informed by rumor and intuition, constructed mental images of the Calloways' lives, filling in gaps with imagination that turned ordinary acts of survival into eerie tableaus of obsession and forbidden desire. Every minor detail, a shadow behind a curtain, the sudden disappearance of one of the brothers into the woods, the faint laughter of Elizabeth, was magnified by distance, interpreted through the lens of fear and superstition. Over time, the story of the Calloways' peculiar household became woven into the fabric of the surrounding hollows, a cautionary tale whispered beside firesides and in church pews alike. Travelers would repeat accounts of what they saw, embellishing details and deepening the sense of unease until the family's reputation assumed an almost mythic quality. Even those who never ventured near the cabin carried an image of the brothers standing as sentinels beside Elizabeth, their loyalty and obsession casting long shadows over the hollow itself. Yet beneath the rumor and speculation lay the stark reality of isolation, a household shaped by necessity and circumstance, a woman navigating impossible tensions, and two brothers bound by blood and desire in ways that defied understanding. The land both protected and exposed them, the hollow serving as a crucible in which human psychology, isolation, and forbidden longing intersected, creating a story that would be retold for generations as both horror and caution. In this way, the whispers of the neighbors served as an unintentional mirror to the household's inner life. Every glance, every gesture, every muffled argument was reflected and distorted through the lens of speculation, heightening the tension that the family already carried. John and Samuel's bond, Elizabeth's role, and the fragile equilibrium they maintained were constantly tested by the eyes of outsiders who saw only fragments and interpreted them as signs of madness or sin. The hollow became a theater in which secrecy and perception collided, where the boundary between truth and rumor was as fragile as the thin timber walls of the cabin. In the minds of the local community, the Calloways embodied the ultimate transgression, a moral and psychological anomaly, yet, to the family themselves, their lives were dictated by rhythms and obligations that outsiders could not comprehend, a quiet horror existing in plain sight, hidden by isolation and obscured by the thick Appalachian mist. Inside the cabin, nightfall brought a transformation that made the Calloway household feel less like a home and more like a ritual space where every glance, every gesture, and every word was charged with unspoken meaning. The firelight flickered against the rough timber walls, casting long, undulating shadows that seemed to dance across the faces of John, Samuel, and Elizabeth, heightening the intensity of the interactions that played out in the flickering glow. Meals were eaten quietly, not for lack of companionship, but because the tension between the three was palpable, a charged atmosphere where the smallest misstep could ignite conflict. Elizabeth moved with cautious grace, performing tasks that were at once necessary and symbolic, aware that the eyes of the two brothers followed her constantly, their attention a weight she could neither shed nor escape. The hollows outside were silent save for the occasional howl of a distant wolf, yet the cabin itself was alive with a psychological thrum, a low hum of obsession and suppressed desire that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the walls. The very air of the house seemed thick, pressing upon them and molding their actions into a choreography of secrecy and unspoken need that neither brother could abandon. In the privacy of the cabin, John and Samuel engaged in rituals born of habit, obsession, and the subtle negotiation of shared desire. Work that seemed mundane, chopping firewood, tending the hearth, washing clothes, became acts laden with attention and intent, each task offering an opportunity to assert presence, claim proximity, or measure influence over Elizabeth's attentions. The brothers were careful not to openly confront one another, yet their silences were heavy, their glances sharp, and every shared moment with Elizabeth became a delicate balance of dominance, concession, and unspoken understanding. She moved between them like a fulcrum, the axis upon which the household's equilibrium depended. Her body language, tone, and expression read with meticulous attention. At times, the tension manifested in subtle cruelty, a remark left hanging, a deliberately slow movement, or a sigh that carried a layered meaning. The psychological pressure was relentless, a quiet, invisible force that shaped every thought and decision, binding all three together in a web that was inescapable yet maintained with eerie precision. Elizabeth's nights were particularly difficult, the long hours spent in dim light offering little relief from the constant scrutiny. She lay awake on her small straw mattress, listening to the wind whip through the hollows and the occasional groan of the cabin settling under the weight of the snow or rain. Shadows moved across the walls, sometimes cast by the fire in the brothers' quarters, other times by the branches scraping against the windows, yet each movement seemed magnified, interpreted as gesture or intent. The presence of the two men was inescapable, their attentions constant, whether expressed through proximity or through absence, a paradoxical combination that left her both protected and trapped. Even in sleep, she could not fully surrender to rest, as dreams were haunted by the unrelenting patterns of observation and subtle assertion that defined her days. In these hours, the boundaries between fear, desire, and survival blurred, creating a psychological landscape that was as treacherous and isolated as the hollows themselves. The brothers' attention to one another in these nocturnal hours was equally complex, a mixture of camaraderie, rivalry, and shared complicity that only deepened the intensity of the household. They spoke little, their communication occurring in glances, gestures, and the subtlest shifts of posture. John's presence was commanding, a constant reminder of his role as elder and protector, while Samuel's quiet persistence created a counterbalance, an undercurrent of tension that Elizabeth could not ignore. The hollows outside acted as both buffer and amplifier, insulating the household from interference while magnifying the intensity of every interaction within. These nights became laboratories of human psychology, testing the limits of patience, endurance, and desire, where the consequences of miscalculation were immediate and often irreversible. The family's isolation, combined with their obsessive attention to one another, created an environment that was both intimate and horrifying, a claustrophobic crucible in which every action carried weight far beyond its apparent significance. At times, the household seemed to slip into a rhythm that was almost mechanical, a series of repeated patterns that offered the illusion of stability but concealed an undercurrent of instability. Breakfasts, chores, and walks to the creek were conducted with the precision of ritual, each step measured, each glance calculated. Elizabeth's role was central, yet she was both participant and observer, fully aware of the unspoken negotiations between the brothers and of the psychological toll that these patterns exacted. The hollows themselves seemed complicit, their oppressive quiet, the dense trees, and the ever-present mist reinforcing the sense that the family's existence was both hidden and suspended in a liminal space, removed from ordinary morality, yet governed by an intense internal logic. Outsiders, if they glimpsed the household, could not comprehend the full dimension of the interactions that unfolded behind the timber walls and shuttered windows. By the winter of 1843, the psychological tension had begun to manifest in more overt ways, subtle shifts in behavior that spoke of the strain of living in a perpetual state of obsession and secrecy. Arguments, though infrequent, carried a sharpness that could cut through the carefully maintained equilibrium, and small acts of defiance or compliance by Elizabeth could ripple through the household like tremors. The firelight seemed to exaggerate every expression, every movement, transforming ordinary gestures into portents of conflict or desire. The forest outside remained silent and watchful, the hollows holding their breath as the family continued to navigate a labyrinth of human emotion, moral ambiguity, and forbidden attachment, their lives entwined in a rhythm that was at once intimate, oppressive, and terrifying. The law of 1842. Kentucky was a distant concept for the Calloway family, but it hovered like a shadow over their isolated existence, a reminder that the world beyond the hollows did not condone the bond they had forged. Deputies and itinerant constables rarely ventured into the dense forests where the family lived, yet rumors of unnatural relationships eventually drifted along the back roads, reaching ears willing to investigate. One March afternoon, a traveling magistrate accompanied by a pair of local men attempted to approach the cabin, armed with a vague sense of duty and the stories that had traveled through the hollows. The snow lay deep in the hollows, muffling their footsteps, and as they drew near, the faint scent of wood smoke and the sight of smoke curling from the chimney gave them pause, as though the land itself was warning them to turn back. The three intruders approached cautiously, calling out in tones meant to elicit a simple greeting, but the response was silence, save for the distant murmur of voices inside. The family, aware of the approach long before the magistrate reached the clearing, had prepared, and in the shadows of the cabin, John and Samuel observed the outsiders with a mixture of caution and calculation, their movements deliberate, measured, and unnervingly precise. Elizabeth, standing near the window, felt the tension immediately, a tightness coiling in her stomach as the two brothers positioned themselves between her and the door. The magistrate, unfamiliar with the peculiarities of frontier isolation, attempted to address the family with formal politeness, asking questions about their affairs, their health, and the purpose of their presence in the hollow. John responded carefully, his words calm and deliberate, giving no hint of the household's secret life, while Samuel's gaze flicked to Elizabeth, a silent reassurance and warning in one glance. The law had arrived, but it was a fragile and ineffective force in the wilderness, a distant authority challenged by the sheer isolation and unspoken power dynamics that defined the cabin. As the magistrate probed further, Elizabeth felt a surge of anxiety, her pulse quickening as she realized the danger their exposure could bring, not merely to herself, but to the delicate balance of relationships that the brothers had painstakingly constructed. Every word spoken in that brief encounter was carefully weighed, every movement considered for its potential consequences, as if a single misstep could unravel the tenuous equilibrium of the household. The encounter with the law was brief, yet it left an indelible mark on the family, introducing a sense of vigilance that had previously existed only in subtle forms. John and Samuel intensified their monitoring of the surrounding woods, patrolling the perimeter in ways that were both protective and territorial, while Elizabeth's movements became even more precise, her awareness of every glance, gesture, and tone heightened. The hollows themselves seemed to respond to the intrusion, the wind carrying a sharper edge, the trees standing more densely, as if conspiring to shield the family from the eyes of outsiders. Even routine tasks became acts of preparation, a ritualized defense against potential intrusion, and the psychological weight of this ever-present threat pressed upon all three members of the household. The law, though never again physically present, had left a lingering tension, a reminder that the world beyond the hollow existed and might at any moment intrude upon the fragile microcosm they had constructed. The magistrate's visit also fueled the imaginations of neighboring communities, who interpreted the family's secrecy as confirmation of the worst rumors. Travelers spoke of the family's ability to evade scrutiny, their silence in the face of questions, and the palpable tension that seemed to radiate from the cabin, interpreting these signs as evidence of guilt and moral transgression. Letters, gossip, and whispered warnings spread along the back roads, weaving a narrative of corruption, forbidden intimacy, and psychological captivity that amplified with each retelling. Yet the reality within the cabin remained complex, rooted in human emotion, desire, and survival, rather than overt criminality, a distinction that outsiders could neither perceive nor understand. In the hollows, where visibility was limited and social norms were distant, the law existed as both a deterrent and a specter, shaping behavior in subtle ways while remaining fundamentally powerless to penetrate the psychological labyrinth of the Calloway household. Over the following months, encounters with outsiders, whether hunters, traders, or wandering travelers, were met with calculated performances, routines that concealed the household's true nature while projecting an appearance of normalcy. John and Samuel orchestrated their movements to maintain control, monitoring Elizabeth's actions and subtly guiding her interactions to ensure that the equilibrium remained unbroken. The hollows themselves became a tool, the dense forests, winding creeks, and uneven terrain functioning as both a barrier and a protective screen, ensuring that any intrusion would be laborious and unlikely to succeed. Every day was a negotiation with the possibility of exposure, a constant rehearsal of social propriety overlaid atop the hidden psychological and emotional currents that defined their lives. The presence of the law in the form of rumors, distant travelers, and that single magistrate's visit transformed the household's dynamics, instilling both caution and vigilance while magnifying the brothers' obsession and Elizabeth's awareness of her precarious position. Their lives became a delicate balancing act, where secrecy was as essential to survival as food or warmth, and every encounter with the outside world had the potential to unravel the careful structure of desire, loyalty, and fear that sustained them. The hollows remained silent observers, the forested landscape a constant companion to the unfolding drama, shaping and constraining the lives of three people bound together in a way that defied understanding, law, and morality.